Hello, welcome everyone. It's a tremendous pleasure to have this in-person event. I think it's our first one, so I'm sure for many of you as well. So we are really delighted to see so many people, members of staff, students, alumni. You're very welcome. So I'm Maria Alvarez. I'm the head of the philosophy department, which is co-hosting this lecture. And my role today is only to introduce the chair for this evening, who is Professor Marion Thain, who is the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and she will be chairing today's lecture. Marion.
Thanks very much to Maria for that. It's a really huge honour to be with you all here tonight. As Maria says, we've got guests, we've got staff, we've got students, former students and current students. And it is a really huge joy to be here in person. This is, I think, one of the first in-person events I've been to this year, and see so many of you here and see such a great crowd. This is really fantastic and really something special. I think this is a moment of coming together again after what seems like, well, it's literally years, isn't it? It feels like a very long time. Now, King's Philosophy Department is one of the very best, and it is one of the very best because of the community that it's built over all of these years. It's the very best because of the people who've been here as students, because of the people who've been here as staff, and that's why this kind of gathering is so very special. And also, I should add, of course, you know, this lecture happens every year, so you're all welcome to come back again, come back next year, be part of this fine tradition with us. And this lecture, of course, is one of this series that was created by Alan Lacey, a lifelong pacifist and somebody who taught at King's for about 15 years. And he was very generous in giving the bequest that allows us to do this as a continuing tradition at King's. But today it's impossible to think about a peace lecture without thinking about Ukraine. And there's nothing I can say to make that any better at all. But I do think it's timely, as those events are still very fresh with us, to be gathering here to think about the topic of tonight's lecture, which is the humanization of endless war and the cause of peace. So, as with previous lectures, we have the most distinguished of speakers with us here for these events. And tonight, it's Professor Samuel Moyn, the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. And Professor Moyn has written extensively on the law of war, international law, human rights, and 20th century European moral and political theory. And most recently, he's published a landmark monograph on the ethics of war. This is the book that many of you will know, Humane, How the United States Have Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. This is the book from last year, from 2021. And in this book, he asks troubling but really urgent questions around what if efforts to make war more ethical, to ban torture and limit civilian casualties, what if those efforts have only shored up the military enterprise and made it sturdier? To advance this case, Moyn looks back at a century and a half of passionate arguments about the ethics of using force. Humane is the story of how America went off to fight and never came back, and how armed combat was transformed from an imperfect tool for resolving disputes to an integral component of the modern condition. As American wars have become more humane, they've also become endless, so Professor Moyn argues. And this provocative book argues that this development might not represent progress at all. So I'm not sure I can promise you a happy ending to tonight's lecture or a joyful conclusion, but I can promise you a really fascinating talk and a really fascinating time here with Professor Moyn. So, over to you.
Well, thank you to begin with for coming. It's exciting to be in person. And it's an enormous privilege to be invited to give this lecture, so I want to begin by thanking Professor Rosa Antoniazza for writing me, and Professor Marion Thane for chairing this session. Now, when this was planned, I didn't know, maybe no one except Vladimir Putin knew that we would be in the midst of a European war tonight. I've tried to update what I had planned long ago to say to reflect this new reality, but we're all thinking about it, and so I want to leave a lot of time to discuss it in comment. So I want to begin in 1945, when the fall after the UN Charter was finalized, which banned aggressive war, starting a war without good enough reason. The Allies held a trial. It was the Nuremberg trial, the International Military Tribunal. And they set up a framework for thinking about war, and in particular, how to adjudicate its wrongs after the fact. And what they did, I think, pioneeringly, is started with what they called aggression. They thought of aggression, starting a war illegally, as the worst thing we can do. And they had good reasons for this priority which they set out. To begin with, as a gateway crime, other crimes could follow. If a war starts illegally, it's predictable, though not necessary, that illegal atrocities will follow. And so they had a theory that you might think of as like the greater includes the lesser. If you ban war, if you deter it, if you stigmatize it, you do the same to war crimes. But the reverse isn't necessarily true. And yet they had other reasons, too, for starting with aggression and making it what was called then, what they called the crime of crimes. First, consider everything that's legal once a state starts a war. What's legal about its conduct, even when the initiation of the war is illegal. First, killing soldiers. The death of soldiers on both sides becomes allowed. Second, the death of some civilians, since today we say that the collateral death of innocent people is allowed in war, assuming that militaries don't directly shoot at civilians and don't kill too many. And so if you police the gateway, if you stop aggression, you stop those things too. And then there are other reasons for the priority of aggression that was this really moral signature of Nuremberg. After all, there are broad costs to war when it breaks out. Someone pays, and lots of things are destroyed, much of it legal. Finally, maybe I think we should consider this most. It's predictable that there will be wide-ranging after effects when wars start, that no one may intend at the start, that may not be the result of someone like the aggressor shooting at someone else, a victim, but rather a result of instability. Consider the wars we've seen in our lifetime that led to regional instability and the death of hundreds of thousands, even when the intervening states didn't kill them directly. Now, this man, Robert Jackson, was a Supreme Court justice in my country, and he took leave to join the four powers that staged the Nuremberg trials. And he did so because of the moral importance of, as he saw it, of this. And in his opening statement, he gave credit to the Soviets, actually, the predecessors of the Russians today, for insisting on the priority of aggression. It had been their idea, but he agreed with it, Jackson said. More important, he said, what we can't do is have this trial, an aggression inquest, be victor's justice. We can't impose penalty on states only when they lose. He used the phrase, the poison chalice. If we pass the National Socialists a poison chalice, he said, this will not lead to the kind of world we want. Everyone, including those organizing the Nuremberg trials, the Soviet Union and the United States too, have to be eligible to be identified as aggressors in the international system, to be charged with doing the worst thing that we can do when it comes to war, starting an illegal war. Now, in my judgment, and I'd love to hear yours later, I think we've abandoned this set of assumptions in the last 50 years. The consensus has changed. The Nuremberg beliefs that aggression comes first is most important to control was lost. Sometimes for bad reasons, sometimes for good, and I'll say in a bit why I think that happened. I think the results have been gargantuan. We have focused in the last 50 years not on controlling the initiation of war, or even the continuation of war when it drags on and on, but rather doing something about the conduct of hostilities, trying to make war more humane in its conduct, and, if we can, punishing those who commit atrocities. Never since Nuremberg has anyone been charged with aggression in the international system. Was it a poison chalice then? Can we change that? Should we change that? We haven't asked that question. And I think we need to now. In fact, as we'll see in recent days, suddenly we've started to do so in light of Vladimir Putin's aggression. Now, I don't think this is a deep conceptual problem if it turns out we just made a mistake. We lost focus. We changed our focus from aggression to atrocity. It would be maybe hard to solve, but it wouldn't be difficult to figure out that we need to do so. But I want to explore something in this lecture that's a little bit scarier. Because Putin wasn't the first aggressor. Actually, there have been a lot of illegal wars in the last 80 years. And what I want to ask, what I want to explore with you is whether when we changed our focus to reducing cruelty in war, we also helped sweep aggression under the rug. We made it harder to focus on, and therefore made it harder to get it back when we need it. So that's what I'm going to be exploring today. It's the subject of this recent book. I promise we'll come back to Ukraine and Putin at the very end. But what I want to do for most of my time is go backwards to the time when it was novel to think that it was worth making war more humane. And there was someone who worried that it was a mistake. He was a novelist. His name was Leo Tolstoy. Most of my time is explore his anxieties about making war more humane and see if he might have been right, even before Putin engaged in his dreadful aggression. So let me start by giving, if I can get this to stay up, a little narrative of his career thinking about this problem. He lived in the middle of the 19th century. He's best known, obviously, as a great, perhaps the greatest novelist of modern times. But he was always thinking about war. And he did so from the first in his career when, as an aristocrat, he signed up to serve in the Crimean War and actually achieved his earliest fame for writing about the Crimean War, in particular the siege in Sevastopol, where he was present and wrote sketches about his experience, what he saw. And the second sketch narrates this really interesting moment. Death dealing decided to take a pause for the sake of helping those soldiers on both sides bleeding out on the battlefield. They're not obligated to do so. They do it as a matter of mercy and morality, not of law. In the 1850s when he wrote these. And then they go back to killing each other. And Tolstoy is cynical. He's also not yet an observant Christian, but he thinks it's unchristian to make war more humane. A kind of parody of Christianity and morality to pause for a second, as if there weren't killing going on, to try to have a kind of holiday and a pause for the sake of humanity. How can they do this, he wonders. Now, there's nothing that deep in this initial comment. It's a cynical comment on the hypocrisy of humanizing killing, which seems not to make sense to him. Well, that was just the beginning of his thinking about this issue, which took its most famous form in his major novel of the next decade, War and Peace. His character, one of his two main characters, Prince Andrei, the act before he's mortally wounded himself, says, "I don't think war should be made more humane." Now, I can't prove it, but he refers to the laws of warfare. And I think it's likely that he was, in a sense, criticizing something really out in the world, the First Geneva Convention, which was finalized just as he was revising War and Peace, which called, if you know, for allowing ordinary people to go onto battlefield to do the work that generals might not do, of picking up the bodies, or if they're still alive, ministering to them. The first treaty that aspires to bring humanity to warfare. And Prince Andrei says it's rubbish. Now, what I want to do is look at how he could think this, because it seems like a good thing to ameliorate the evils and suffering of war. It's not unchristian. It's not hypocritical, because the people trying to reduce suffering didn't start those wars. They're just trying to minimize suffering within them, whether they're worth fighting or not. And yet, Prince Andrei gives an argument that's different from the one 10 years earlier. It goes like this: not taking prisoners, which would now be a gross war crime, which is his example. If a soldier surrenders, killing him anyway would make war less cruel, Prince Andrei says. If there were none of this playing at generosity and warfare, we should never go to war except for something worth facing certain death for. Now, I want you to notice something about this argument. First of all, it's on the same normative terrain as that of his enemies. he says our common goal is to reduce cruelty in war. There's just a debate about how to do it. You think making war more humane would reduce cruelty, but I think something else. And in particular, it's that leaving war brutal would lead it to break out less frequently, and thus for there to be less cruelty overall when computed down the line. Now, this was an incredibly common view, actually, that Prince Andrei voices at this time. There were different versions of it. The founder of the laws of war in my country, who wrote merely a national code for the Union Army the year before the First Geneva Convention, named Francis Lieber, was a follower of Karl von Clausewitz, the great military theorist. And both of them said, no, it's that brutal war will make war shorter. If we make it more humane, it will last longer, and thus there will be more cruelty, not less. Now, it's not just that these arguments are all assuming the same normative standard, the reduction of cruelty. You can tell that they're what we would call empirical conjectures, or maybe they're just blind guesses. And to that extent, they seem very bad guesses. I'm sure we can all think of wars that have been brutal, that lasted a long time. Maybe one just started the other day. Or we might suspect that leaving war brutal will not make it less frequent. Who knows? Hard to prove. Very unreliable as a reason not to at least try to minister to the wounded. So this is Prince Andrei's argument, and I just want to be very clear that I think it's dubious. Think of 20th century history and wonder, would you really follow the man? Although it's only fair to note that some theorists of mutually assured destruction cited Prince Andrei and said it's the threat of carnage that will keep war from breaking out. All right, I'm gonna try, and I think Tolstoy tried as he evolved even further to give a better argument than Prince Andrei's. And it has a slightly different form. It's about the perverse effects of making war more humane, which reduces cruelty, but may incur other risks. Because maybe war's not just about cruelty. And we have to figure out if making war more humane, a noble and just practice, could incur such risks. In particular, the risk of endlessness, the risk of entrenching war. In particular, the risk of facilitating war or allowing its easier legitimation. This, I think, is a slightly different argument than Prince Andrei made. I think it's more plausible, given what we've seen in recent history. And I want to show that Tolstoy spent a lot of time trying to develop it. Before I do that, let me just mention that, this isn't the only possible, view that you might take as a candidate for your own allegiance. Because there were the humanizers who said, no, we've got empirical conjectures as well. We have a blind guess to make about what would happen if we make war more humane. And they said, we'll bring peace. So that man on the earlier slide with the Geneva Convention was named Henri Dunant. He won the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, but he didn't really found the Red Cross or have much to do with the evolution of the laws of war in the 19th century. This man did, named Gustave Moynier. And he says at a certain point to his fellow Swiss, look, if you join in my cause of making war more humane, you get to be a pacifist in the bargain, indirectly. Because making war more humane, far from postponing peace, will bring it into at least make it more likely to take hold. The reason seems to be like a theory of the foot in the door. If soldiers on the opposite sides of battlefields think their enemy's human enough for there to be some restraints in the midst of killing, it's the first inkling that they shouldn't be killing one another at all. Now, I have to say this one seems pretty dubious to me as well. We can think of the long campaigns that we've seen since Dunant's time and Moynier's time that may well have struck a blow for humanity in warfare, but have hardly led to the abolition of war, maybe not even its reduction. Maybe he's right, but I want to explore Tolstoy's contrary empirical conjecture that maybe making war more humane could entrench it, could leave us with an endless and more humane form of conflict. Now, interestingly, Moynier actually suspected that this could happen. In an amazing moment in one of his articles, he says, look, if it turns out that I'm wrong, and my project of making war humane makes it harmless, with less suffering, but it goes on anyway, then I'll change my mind. I'll become a direct pacifist because my empirical conjecture will have been defeated. War will be something independently wrong that I need to control. And I'm not suggesting that if we could raise him from the dead, he would worry that war's too humane now. But what if it's becoming more humane and, just as Tolstoy feared, is getting entrenched, not ended, in virtue of this fact? So let me spend a little time with the later Tolstoy, because I think he did his best work late in life. He embraces the Christianity openly, a very idiosyncratic version that had been, as you saw earlier, subterranean for him from the first. And he really doesn't follow any existing Christian sect ever known, but builds his own Christianity based on this one line in the Sermon on the Mount that counsels to resist not evil. Immensely influential in this regard on Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King later. The ethics he adopts in this phase of his career, when he becomes the world's most famous pacifist and the world's most famous vegetarian, is no longer consequentialist. It's not about measuring the effects of our acts. It might be that violence is just wrong as such. And yet, I want to show that he engaged in some more honing of that empirical conjecture he made, that making war more humane might entrench it. So he does this by looking for a theory of, let's call it, agents and pathways. How could it happen that making a violent corporal practice more humane entrenched it? And it's not like he can prove it, but he suggests there might be some pathways that are followed to reach this result. And he engages in two really interesting comparisons that I want to explore with you with other violent corporal practices, namely chattel slavery and the slaughter of non-human animals. So the first involves Tolstoy looking backward from his time, thinking about a practice that's been abolished, mostly, including serfdom, which existed in his country until the 1860s. In particular, he looks at the biggest legal project there had been around slavery in this country's empire and in my country before abolitionist movements were powerful enough. It was called amelioration. and it proposed to make slavery kinder and gentler. And it seems, to some historians at least, though again, nothing depends on the truth of this, that ameliorating slavery gave it a new lease on life. It may not have facilitated it, but it made it more legitimate to enough people to last longer. And you can see that if that's true, it doesn't have to be false that making war more humane could have the same effect. But what I'm interested in is Tolstoy's story of how this happened in his past. He is interested in what I'm going to call the advocate's compromise. He's interested in those who want to make the world a better place in the face of an obscene practice. But they decide to compromise. They decide to make a deal with the slaveholders. They decide they don't want to or can't challenge the right to private property that slaveholders enjoyed for centuries in other human beings. And so instead they say, we'll work with you to make your slavery less cruel. And actually, it was helpful to the slaver to do so, insofar as it made his property more secure. And Tolstoy's basic point is that we're doing it again. If you make war more humane, you're repeating the mistake of compromising, of engaging in harm reduction, rather than gathering to abolish this practice. Now, this is, I hope you're thinking, about this, a kind of interesting analogy, but it has a lot of problems with it. I'm just going to mention a few so that you can consider where you come down on it. If it works, it's extremely powerful, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it was possible to abolish slavery, and it's not possible to abolish war. Clearly it's much more difficult to abolish all wars. Maybe he would change the argument to say, for every war, there's an abolitionist question. Is it worth fighting? Does it have to be tolerated? If it's humanized, don't we then make it last longer instead? But you might take the view that slavery and war are just too different as practices for the force of this analogy to hold. You might also look back at the era of slavery and disagree with that historian on this slide and conclude that actually making slavery less cruel allowed abolitionism to flower. As more people began to see slaves as human beings, it became intolerable to allow people to hold others in bondage. There's a last really interesting possibility, which is that maybe you don't think, as a kind of strategic matter, you can directly challenge slavery yet. But you think that spotlighting the cruelty of it can't help but delegitimate the practice. And so you're kind of engaged in covert abolitionism in focusing on the inhumanity of slavery. And just to give you a sense of where I'm taking this, what if after Abu Ghraib, many of us concluded that the wars we'd had allowed our statesmen to launch were mistaken and wrong? And the best way to undermine them was to spotlight the human consequences. Now, all of these are possible. I want to suggest that it's also possible that Tolstoy was right, and that this analogy suggests that when our reformers demand more humane war, we should ask, are they incurring a risk of entrenching what they're humanizing? Because that's what seems to have happened with slavery. Okay, now let's turn to Tolstoy's other comparison, which is about a different group of people, not the advocates, but the audience or beneficiary. And he targets what I want to call the beneficiary's bad faith. Now, this argument is already in War and Peace, where Prince Andrei says, making war more humane is like the magnanimity and sensibility of the lady who turned sick at the sight of the slaughtered calf. She's so kind-hearted that she cannot see blood, but she eats fricasseed veal with very good appetite. Now, this was a kind of obsession for Tolstoy, because many years later, when he stopped eating meat himself, he annoyed his wife until she accepted it and helped him create one of the most widely circulating vegetarian cookbooks. He kind of stuck with this example. He wrote a preface to one of the earliest texts on animal ethics, and it involved him going to see one of the new humane slaughterhouses. And he uses this same analogy. Think of the lady. I mean, obviously this is gendered in ways we could, query, who's so sensitive that she's unable not only herself to inflict suffering on animals, but to bear the sight of its infliction, but she still eats them. And essentially, this is an allegation of bad faith, that we think we're better people as members of the audience or as the beneficiaries of violent acts done for our sake or in our name when we've pled for their humanization, for the reduction of suffering in the mass death of our prey. And the consequence is that we are doing something evil but think we're good people. So this is, I want to suggest, his second causal pathway. Now, maybe you think bad faith is a moral error, let's say on its own, even if it has no effect in the world, but what if it does? It's possible that making war more humane could lead to the facilitation of war in a new, more humane form, or at least make it easier to legitimate amongst those who care about the humanization of their violence. Okay, so those are his arguments, and I want to suggest we've lived through the conversion of what had been early anxieties into a real syndrome. And this was before Putin acted. It was when we acted in staging a war on terror that had two stages. The first, as you know, involved potentially illegal intervention in two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. We could debate whether the Afghan intervention broke international law as such, was aggressive in the way Nuremberg framed things. Iraq definitely was. I think almost no one now disagrees with that. And yet what distinguished these two interventions was that they were heavy footprint. Massive armies went abroad and occupied other countries. And the results were grotesque. The human cost was massive. Now, even then, of course, we could debate how far this country's army and mine and other allies were following the rules of war. But we know that at least my country's CIA didn't want to do so and was given permission to torture. So I'm not going to claim, I think it would be edgy to claim that even this first form of the war on terror was affected by the humanization of war since the 19th century under international law. But I will claim that the second form of the war on terror was. It grew up in the aftermath of the first form of the war on terror as it became less savory in our capitals and amongst our populations. As that happened, the war on terror didn't end. It took on a new guise. It led the war more places than just those initial two, many more. And it extended in time. Indeed, by some accounts, it's not ended yet. As you probably know, the most famous new form of the war on terror involved armed drones, which involved the building of drone bases across a wide arc of the earth. But we shouldn't, fixate on drones, as interesting as they are, because the new form of the war on terror also involved a massive transition away from heavy footprint warfare to light footprint warfare, not just no footprint. And I'm referring to the massive escalation of the use of special forces, small bands of men who visit and kill, and take care to do so cleanly. Both of these forms, I want to suggest, deserve a lot of further study. I'm just interested in the rhetorical and real humanization of the second form, because it was the setting, I think, for Tolstoy's worst nightmare. Now, that required a lot of boring history, which I won't, waste your time with. From what I can tell, Tolstoy was way early, because war wasn't even desired to be humane or more humane for a very long time. The characters in the 19th century I mentioned were writing at the height of European empire, in the midst of centuries of brutality perpetrated by Europeans, including, obviously, those from this country around the world. And there was no public desire for humane war, no matter what the Swiss wanted. I think that changed. It changed precisely because decolonization made the new global southern countries actors rather than victims of brutal war. Interestingly, their main agenda after decolonization was strengthening the prohibition of aggression. But secondarily, they demanded more humane war if it broke out. And they didn't get the first thing in the long run, but they did get the second. That happened through the updating of the Geneva Conventions, which you probably know best from their 1949 last formal versions, but they were updated in the 1970s. Amazingly, the first time it was clearly said that it's illegal to shoot at a civilian. And when a new constraint, the proportionality rule, was imposed on previously unregulated aerial bombardment in particular, as well as other kinds of strikes that demand that the collateral damage you cause in civilian death not outweigh the military advantage you gain. And these, I think, were the first real steps towards humanizing war in content of the law. But I think there was also other big factors. In countries across the Atlantic that had preserved Nuremberg through the Vietnam War, just as an example, a famous English philosopher, Bertrand Russell, held an aggression trial in the late 60s about Vietnam. Those movements disappeared. And in their stead, reformers came who hadn't existed with the same numbers and prominence, that instead of concerning themselves with the outbreak of war, concerned themselves with its conduct. We can think of those as human rights organizations, which didn't operate in the brutality of decolonization or Vietnam, but became extremely important even as the content of the laws of war became more humane. And even the militaries got the news that it was important to fight less brutally. It was easier for European militaries to do so because they were more or less done with centuries of brutality and allowed my country to provide their security. But my country's military, too, as a result of the My Lai massacre, embraced the humanization of war. It became incredibly important to a lot of officers to inculcate values that had been lacking in the American military. And this, I think, was quite important. More broadly, broadest of all, there was cultural change. Again, for centuries, brutality had been desirable, especially to those who differed from white Christians across lines of race and religion. And the weapons that were made had the purpose of killing more people, more brutally, not fewer and less. But I think there was a massive change. If you consider how World War II came to be remembered increasingly in the 1970s and 80s, it was no longer a kind of patriotic war of self-defense. It was a war in which Jews died. Innocents were slaughtered in the millions. And what happened is that a cultural consensus emerged, not the Nuremberg one, that illegal war is the worst thing, but that cruelty in war is. And I believe that set up the dynamics of our time in the humanization of our wars. I think there were two big stages in this. The first, after the Abu Ghraib revelations. When My Lai had been revealed, there had been an anti-war movement, and atrocity added fuel to its fire. There was nothing really comparable after 9/11. And whatever the intent of those stigmatizing torture and detainee abuse, it had the opposite effect as My Lai. It removed the bug from the program of war. Far from ending it, it humanized it. This happened, I think, because in this crucial period of 2004, starting in March when Abu Ghraib was revealed, the war was delegitimated, the first form at least, as brutal, not illegal in its initiation or continuation, but in how it was being fought. And then the same thing happened, amazingly, when Barack Obama took office, because he understood, I think brilliantly, that the way to legitimate the successor war, the new form of the war on terror, was to promise its humanity and in part bring it about. You can find very good evidence of this, in the first place in his extraordinary Nobel Peace Prize address, when he acknowledged that he couldn't, in this case, claim the legacy of his elective ancestor, Martin Luther King, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. With all due respect, King had never been the leader of the greatest military superpower in world history. Hadn't had to face the challenge that Obama did. Instead, Obama name-checked Henri Dunant. First time I think any great leader mentioned that man, the very first winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, who had not been a pacifist, but someone who'd called for more humane war. Now, proving this argument that the war was given a new lease on life through its rhetorical humanization, and to an extent its real humanization, is very hard. As I said, Tolstoy doesn't even try. He just raises suspicion and gives you some pathways. That's all I'm doing. I can't prove that this happened, but I can tell you that the advocates' compromise happened. For those last 50 years, we haven't had anti-war movements of note. We've had humanizing movements, which compromise with states and militaries, never challenging the legality of their wars, but demanding, sometimes successfully, that they be fought less brutally. And what was Obama doing in this kind of moment, when he explained that his wars would be fought humanely, except inviting us to indulge in the beneficiaries' bad faith, to think that we're good or good enough people because the wars that are fought for our sake or in our name are no longer brutal. Okay, well, I'm going to conclude this lecture by bringing us back to the present. And I'd really like, again, to hear if you think that any of this is relevant to this new moment when it's not America or its British sidekick that we're concerned about in an endless war on terror, although it does go on, but Putin, a very different kind of leader at the head of a very different kind of state. Now, interestingly, in that irate rant he gave just days before launching his aggressive war, he called out all the lawbreaking of our states, not its torture, not the excess civilian casualties of the drones we've used to patrol a massive space, but instead aggression. Interestingly, he points first in his speech to the bombing of Belgrade in 1999 in defense of the Kosovars. And he says, this is true, that we did it in full knowledge that it was illegal to break the UN Charter for a good cause. But we did it anyway, saying it was legitimate. And then he refers to other wars, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Interestingly, he doesn't, given what I've been saying, refer to the broader war on terror, the drone war and the special forces war, even though it went a lot more places. And in my judgment, was equally illegal in going those new places, equally aggressive, although it didn't kill as many people. Now, if we think that, like in 2014, Putin is out for conquest, he's doing something that our states haven't, at least for a long time. And so we could distinguish what his aggression is about that way. But I don't think he sees it that way. He's engaged, he says, in a war of regime change, which is just what we've done in several instances. Now, I hope it's clear that I would never contradict our parents who taught us that two wrongs don't make a right. And maybe Putin is offering these claims about our aggression in extenuation for his, but if he's doing so, it's a gross moral error. And maybe it's the case, I mean, I have no idea, that Putin would have engaged in his aggression, even absent our prior pattern of aggression, the wars that we allowed to happen and humanized. But it is only fair to say, you know, in thinking about his hypocritical citation of our acts as if it bore on his, that this series of wrongs is something to think about. Two wrongs don't make a right, but they make a pattern. Now, if you wanted to get really edgy, you could ask, is he also planning a more humane war? Learning from us? I don't think so. I mean, it's only fair to say that, like your country, but unlike mine, his current war is being fought under an international human rights regime. And indeed, there's already been action in the European Court of Human Rights around the Ukraine invasion. I assume we all think, looking at the news that we've been treated to of cluster bombs, which we've used also, and just direct targeting of civilians, that he's in a different category. He's not trying to fight a humane war. he has different conditions of legitimation at home. And so the argument that Tolstoy made, and that might have us in its sights, won't apply to him. I think that's probably right, although I think if we compared the war as we're seeing it unfold to prior great power wars, I think even it too is marked by the transformation of war we've seen in the last half century that has led it to be conducted more humanely, with more consciousness of the rules, in part because advocates are out there pressuring for these rules to apply more or less well. But what I do want to say is that we've seen in our lifetimes a new age of war under our noses that has been tolerant of aggression long before Putin acted and focused elsewhere. And it's us that I'm interested in, the priorities we've had and what paradoxical effects that may have had, even in leading to our present. All right, well, I also want to say, and this is my last suggestion, that it's ironic that I think no one more than Putin has restored the priority of aggression to our agenda. Because in the past few days, we've seen really just unprecedented interest in it, including amongst those who looked past it or perpetrated it themselves. I've given you the example of Gordon Brown, who amazingly proposed the other day setting up a new Nuremberg. Since the United Nations Security Council, at least, is stymied by Russia's veto, what if a like-minded set of states like the Allies in World War II set up an aggression inquest? Never mind that he hadn't had that idea when it came to American or British aggression all those years ago in which he was involved. I still think, even if we're worried about the appearance of those who have been aggressors condemning aggression now, that we should welcome this turn. It allows us to retrieve, after an era of humanizing war alone, that original idea that in almost all cases, war is bad in itself, and for the other things, even the legal things that follow in its wake. And if Putin has given us the gift of retrieving that priority, I don't think we should thank him, but we should think about whether we should use the opportunity he's given us to restore aggression to the leading role it once had. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much, and take questions.
Thank you very, very much for that really great lecture. We've got some time for questions, so if you're happy to stay at the mic and answer some questions, just have hands up over there.
Hi. Thank you. That was very compelling, much to think about. I haven't read your book, but based on the premise that you introduced today, I'm just wondering if the sort of, to put it very simply, the underlying assumption of your premise is that America cares about being humane, or is it more to do with the sort of spectacular impunity that has been around war and its aggression that has sort of emboldened it to go on with wars? And I guess my question is an iteration of the recent sort of questions about whether international law is effective at all or not, but I can't help but think whether it's got more to do with the failing sort of just systems of accountability that we do have wars that are going on and a war that's sort of, again, about to sort of happen. Yeah.
Thanks so much. No, it's a terrific question. So I am making the point that, like many states, America has turned a blind eye to aggressive war. And more important, Americans have, and the broader global community, and have taken a tolerant view of starting wars. Now, of course, that's a vast generalization because there are a lot of footnotes, but I think that's the enduring truth of our time. It's also true that around the world, and Americans too, have imposed new conditions of legitimation on war that demand its humanization. Now, of course, it's often a lie. It's just rhetorical, not real. And a lot of great activism and journalism is about revealing how brutal so-called humane war is. I do think it's more humane than in the past, because it's not just rhetorical, but in many cases there have been real controls placed on the conduct of hostilities. And so what I'm trying to get us to struggle with is to take seriously those who say the problem with war is that we don't have accountability for atrocity yet, because that's true. War is nowhere near humane enough yet. But there's this other problem. Even as it's become more humane, aggression has exploded. And if we merely humanize that world of big states that can get away with it, crossing borders, then I think we'll be upset with the results, because it will involve a lot of endless war. And the fact that it is more humane, thanks to our diligence, reflects well on us. But it might also mean that we failed to manage or control the risk that we incurred in making it more legitimate, because it's become more humane. So that's the main argument.
Thank you. That was a really great lecture. I was wondering if you say that if there's an international framework which essentially bans war, crossing of borders, doesn't that restrict the tools, say a well-meaning power has at its disposal to, achieve justice and ensure that, say, aggressors aren't mistreating their civilians? Or are there any conditions wherein you think war would be legitimate as a possible option?
Thank you. So I think that's an essential question, because it gets at a mentality many of us shared for many years. And I mentioned this briefly, that maybe the marginalization of aggression was for a good cause or for good reasons, or at least well-meant. And it's exactly what you're suggesting, that many of us thought in the 1990s that there were beneficent wars, and that a regime that merely polices aggression of states externally ignores their aggression in, you use that term, I think, analogically or metaphorically, at home. And maybe we, don't just need a range of tools, but we need military force. And of course, that's the Kosovo case. That's the beginning of the Libya case, although it quickly evolved into regime change. And I guess, I don't have a moral reason to take that question seriously, but I think we've all lived an experience where it turns out that even well-meant wars tend to make the world worse. And above all, I think we've neglected that they set up the possibility of pretextual abuse by others who are not as well-meaning. And, you know, Putin is at the top of the list because his argument for illegal intervention in Ukraine is very bad, but it has, in some of its versions, it's been like our rationale for bombing Belgrade or going further than we, were permitted by the UN in Libya. And so I think, my own response to your question is like empirical, that it would be nice if war could make the world a better place, except that every war that I've seen in the past half century, when we began to become more tolerant of it, made it worse. And so we have a lot of learning to do about our false expectations. That's not to say that the internal justice of states ought not to be our concern. But whether it justifies war seems to me a very different question, one we should think very differently about.
I'm just curious about what you said about the conditions of legitimation and the different cases. So you could have a political leader who says, we'll go to war because it's the morally right thing to do, not just for our country, but for humanity as a whole. And then you can have a different political leader who says, we'll go to war because we need to defend our own interests, right? And I was wondering whether you think that that difference makes a difference with respect to how likely you are to go for the humane war option or not.
It's a really interesting question, which I haven't thought about. I mean, as you know, probably lawyers just rigorously distinguish between the rationale for the resort to force, the initiation of war, continuation of it on the one hand, and the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. And they've even, gone back to the Latin to, illustrate this distinction and really demand the separation, although, philosophers have challenged this. I guess it's not obvious to me. I mean, so first you're asking an empirical question about, like, what do people believe about the legitimation of wars? First, they start with the rationale for starting it that's been offered. And then there's a question, how does the way it's conducted play in, or claim, and more important, or equally important, claims around how it's being conducted? And I guess I'm not sure. I mean, I would say no matter the rationale, you could have legitimation afforded by the humanity of the war. And, it could be that as an original rationale for war kind of evaporates, like in the Iraq War, the humanizing effect doesn't really, countervail or overcome the kind of, evaporating legitimacy. And I think that happened in the case of the Iraq War in particular. But then you come to, the broader war on terror, and there's a rationale that's about self-defense, and yet there are also a lot of arguments that it wasn't providing that self-defense. It might actually even be creating new enemies. And, the point I tried to make at the very beginning is that, some of the aggressive acts we've seen in the Middle Eastern instability that ensued, have indeed led to such new enemies as ISIS. And then I think there's just a question about, like, when there's uncertainty about the rationale, it hasn't evaporated. It might be that the humanity claims kind of provide it some legitimation to kind of keep it going. I do think that if the broadest number of people in a country that's intervening think the war is just and necessary, maybe it happens regardless of how humane it is or how it's represented. And conversely, if people have lost faith in a war, it won't matter that the leader comes and says, don't worry, it's humanely fought. But then I think most cases, which are somewhere in between. And maybe it's going to be really important in that case.
Thank you very much. Terrific lecture, lots of things to think. Thank you. My question is, you said when you were replying to Putin's speech, you said this is a case of two wrongs don't make a right. But I would say it's more like a case of tu quoque.
Right.
And I think that the problem is that tu quoque is a fallacy normally, except in the context in which we are talking about who is morally legitimate to say you shouldn't do that. And the problem is that we don't have an adjudication to settle
Yes.
who has the right. And this brings me to my question, which is, do we have criteria to say what is an aggression? Because unless we have clear-cut criteria to say what is an aggression, the problem is that going back to the concept of aggression is going to be like not having like a clear-cut criterion to say who's doing it wrong. I mean, Putin is saying that the aggression, he suffered the aggression.
Those are both wonderful points. So let me just take them in order. So obviously, you're right that it's a fallacy, but it could have, there are a lot of people who, accept fallacious statements, and it changes their minds or motivates them, and there haven't been a lot of people in the West, I think, who have taken Putin seriously. And my suggestion is we should, not because we should commit the fallacy, but because we shouldn't, exempt ourselves from the charge we rightly make against him. Now, it is pretty rich for the actual politicians who have been involved in our aggressive wars to charge him with one, although they're morally right to do so and legally on firm ground in doing so. But I think it's worth, avoiding the fallacy, but preserving, the reality that this didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, on the second question, that's, a huge question that is much debated. There was a lot of work done after Nuremberg on defining aggression. There's like a 1974 United Nations document, and a lot of people are upset with it. And there's the International Criminal Court, which belatedly added a basically toothless possibility of indicting aggression, and people debate that definition. But to me, then the response would be to kind of debate and on clarity would be compared to what? Because it's the nature of law to have lawfare go on, where there's just going to be endemic controversy about the meaning of the standards. There are some, and I don't agree with them, who think that the difference between the rules around going to war are just sparse and they're too contestable, whereas the rules around regulating hostilities and making them more humane are more precise and so forth, and detailed, and that part's true. But I think that we shouldn't draw a kind of distinction of that kind, because when we look at the lawyering, you find that lawyers will always take rules and interpret them. And the last 40 years, and especially the era of the War on Terror, has been a kind of festival and reinterpretation of these humane standards by states, especially powerful states, to make them more permissive. And so I just think we have to accept that that's what legal argument involves. It's political to the core. And we shouldn't then turn our backs on aggression because of this feature. We have to have other reasons to do so. And I think there is a pretty broad consensus that the Iraq War was aggressive. And I think there is a pretty broad consensus that the Ukrainian intervention was aggressive. And so we could start there and see what other wars could be swept in.
Hi, my question is it not just a smokescreen, to use words like humane, for politicians to justify their actions so that their people, whoever their people are, feel good about being aggressors? So there's rules that we're going to be very nice to people, we're going to hit particular targets, we're not going to hit civilians. So is it not just a war of words? Because underlying all of it, war is aggressive and people die, however you do it.
So that's a wonderful question too, and I think it speaks to our suspicion that, you know, the very phrase humane war would be oxymoronic, and that what we should really focus on is the persisting brutality of recent wars rather than their humanization, or if we do, on how it's rhetorical rather than real. And my trouble with that is that it's obscurantist in the following sense. It does matter how wars differ from one another, and they do. And of course, they involve killing, but vastly different numbers of people, and in different ways, and with different effects and results. And so to me, it's almost, in a sense, scarier if it turns out to be true, and I think it is, that it's not just a rhetoric, but that war is kinder and gentler than in prior eras, great power war in particular. And I don't think it's contestable to say so if you would compare, you know, the centuries of genocide in which, you know, this and other countries engaged in the colonial era and in the wars of decolonization, whether you want to cite, you know, Malaya or Kenya, or in my country, Vietnam. And it seems of great significance then that in the latter phases of the war on terror, there was a genuine effort, again, for legitimation's sake, and for the sake of killing people on a continuing basis, to do so differently. Now, I think if we don't stare that fact in the face, we're not seeing what we're up against, especially if we think the wars itself is wrong apart from the death and injury it involves. Because I think that's what we've really forgotten in the last 50 years. And if you indulge me for a second, you could even imagine this humanization being taken more and more seriously precisely because we advocate that outcome. And then we would have a kind of global great power policing, increasingly bloodless, more careful, because we demanded it. But it's really not about death then, it's about domination. Hence the centrality of surveillance to this new war like none other. And that helps us get at what the wrong we're actually concerned about is, which is not death and injury, which may be declining, but the domination of some peoples over others across lines of race and wealth. So that's why I just want to insist that we not treat it as just a lie, because there's truth to it, and it's in a way scarier than if it were just a lie.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation on the law, on the conduct of hostilities. I have a question if your reasoning is also applicable to other areas of international maritime law, in particular the law of occupation. I think that today we are more concerned about how an occupation is conducted. I think about Palestine, Western Sahara, Nagorno-Karabakh, rather than saying, let's stop the occupation. Today, Erdogan met with, I think, the Prime Minister from Israel. He asked for economic development in occupied Palestine. In the past, he would have asked for end of the occupation. Thank you.
I can be very brief, yes. Actually, I think it's these kinds of arguments are applicable to a very wide range of practices, not just war. But if we're sticking to war, we should definitely focus on the rise of humanized occupation. And the reason, for historical reasons, I think, is that it came first in the kind of humane counterterror that Israel invented before 9/11 and was globalized in a certain way, not in the form of occupation, but in another form, as I described, by our countries thereafter. Of course, you could get broader within like quasi-war and think about economic sanctions, which have long been touted as more humane alternatives to war. And they can be, but they can also be more brutal and kill more people than conventional weapons. And so I think we're in a moment of struggle when we have to think about sanctions very seriously and whether they're really not wars on populations, especially to the extent they're untargeted or we tank, certain economies. And again, that's a very scary prospect because that's exactly what Putin said is happening today. But that doesn't mean we don't have to think seriously about our regimes of war. And if we really are embracing sanctions as an alternative to war, but it ends up hurting or killing more people, then we need to think about what that means and what our response is.
One more at the back, and then
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. You make a powerful case that increased attention to humanization has led to taking our eye off the ball of the superior priority of preventing aggression. But that suggests a very pessimistic conclusion, namely that rightly restoring preventing aggression ought to lead us to completely ignore considerations of humanization. Of course, the crime of crimes will be committed, and we should absolutely do nothing to humanize it, because otherwise we'll just take our eye off the ball of aggression again. And I mean, is that the direction you'd like to push?
No, that's Prince Andrei's view in a certain way. And I'm suggesting more modestly that we can see that humanizing a good and necessary thing, especially for wars we haven't prevented, ought to be pursued, indeed more than we do, since I totally agree that mostly claims about the humanization of war mask its continuing violence. And yet, we could learn that there's a risk to control, that there's this entrenchment risk. Now, in many cases, it's not, credible or significant. And then once at least we've taken the time to reach that conclusion, we have nothing to worry about. But then there are going to be, situations in which the contingent risk is incurred. And then we do have to control and manage it. And my suggestion is that our countries have been in precisely that situation, because there is some relation between the humanization of our wars and the laxness with which we've let them continue endlessly. And there's a broader relationship, obviously, between the fall of anti-war movements. I mean, the person who endowed this lecture to one side, and the rise of the concern with humanization, which I think has set up risks which we ought to attend to.
there's a question here, and then I know there's also at the
Hi, I've been wondering about the reason for the fact that this shift happened from the crime of aggression to this the other crimes maybe in the Rome Statute. And I've been thinking maybe it has to do, obviously you mentioned the crime of aggression, there's been a long discussion on the definition and it's been introduced later. And then also I've been wondering maybe it has to do with the fact that there's state immunity and it's maybe easier to hold people accountable for other crimes than probably the highest echelon of states who would be responsible for aggression. So accepting your theory that we should make this crime more, give more weight to it again, what do you think we would have to do? Maybe would we have to abandon immunity for high state officials, or do you have any suggestion on how we could make this more pertinent again?
It's a fantastic kind of two-part question, because you asked kind of a kind of causal or historical question about why this switch, and then you asked, you suggested some steps to take to undo it. I think there's just a range of reasons, and I think the kind of doctrinal reason you give about the immunity of heads of state who are likelier to commit aggression than war crimes, although they may order them. But that then means that we have a legal regime in the era of atrocity that's about, let's say, the little fish, and that doesn't seem like a good thing domestically in our, when we allow the most powerful people impunity and arrest the poor. We think that's a bad thing, but it seems like we've set up that possibility much more graphically. But I would point to some other reasons, basically hers, that after decolonization, we wanted to be cosmopolitan in a new way, and the old way of conquest and empire was off the table. But we didn't want to abandon concern for humanity, and that's noble. It's just that it led to an erosion of the norms against the resort to force. In fact, it justified that erosion. And so I think that's a very big reason, and I don't have a problem with it except, as I mentioned, the empirical one. Now, I'm not a big, I personally disagree with, your former prime minister. Maybe you're not British, but I don't think we should have an aggression court. Anytime soon. Because it's really the creature of great power politics. What I would like to see is work on Security Council reform. Because in a nuclear world, it may not matter that, we may want to avoid kind of, going after Putin, whatever that would mean. But I think we should have, a forum where you can get a consensus of states branding another, even a great power, an aggressor. Now, you could reply, well, that happened in the General Assembly, but that's kind of plan B. And maybe there's a possibility that we could devise a new Security Council that could constrain the powerful and not just the weak. And that would especially matter because it's not just about after the fact justice. It's about a kind of collective, security arrangement that could anticipate, that could interrupt, that could prevent, and not just punish. So that would be my preference, but this is a, if I'm right, I haven't done enough thinking, and there are a lot of possible options for how to recover aggression. Now, it's only fair to mention that the ICC has added it to its list of crimes very belatedly and basically meaninglessly. And there are other proposals. So there are a lot of new ideas out there, and I think we're entering potentially a new age unless we spurn this opportunity to kind of reflect on our switch in priorities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering how the idea of humanizing war is maybe partially cropped up by selecting between certain kinds of outcomes or harms in war and not others, and to what extent that matters to your story. So the example I have in mind, but I may be all wrong about the facts here, so you'll correct me if I do, is, you know, all we've seen constantly being mentioned is like harms in terms of death and blood and injury, right? But of course, one of the harms in wars is sexual violence, right? That happens, I mean, it happens everywhere, but it happens in war zones. Haven't seen reports of it yet, but it's no doubt happening as we speak in war zones, amongst refugees, right, all over the place. Often, I mean, sometimes, but very often not directly perpetrated by armies themselves, or at least not officially perpetrated by armies and therefore states. So if that kind of harm of war, and you know, there might well be other, are kind of construed as I suspect they are, as side effects or as kind of invisible, and therefore not subject, or at least not subject to the same degree to this humanizing narrative that we can have for precision weapons and, you know, the examples that spring to mind. How does that, I mean, am I right about this? And then how does that matter for these kind of arguments that you're making?
So you're surely right in your great question that there is a history of the specific content of the prohibitions in the laws of war, and those are selective, and they're political choices, and we have not gone very far towards acknowledging the range of harms and all the forms of suffering in war. Now, in fairness, there's been a gendered critique of international humanitarian law, you know, not for very long, but with some effect, like the criminalization of rape, which began in some of the ad hoc tribunals of the 1990s. And, you know, rape is a crime of war under the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, and, you know, and so forth. So I think, you know, we could always do more and better there. What I'm not sure is whether it is, you know, it's going to be sufficient to like itemize all the neglected harms of war, all the different forms of suffering, and prohibit them, because it might ignore, let's say, war as a crime rather than all the war crimes. So just as an example, a lot of people claim, again, plausibly, that even if drones don't strike, they leave behind post-traumatic stress disorder due to living under the drones day in and day out. And that's a harm, and we could, you know, try to, you know, invent a new kind of international humanitarian law that took it seriously. And I'm for that. But, you know, I would also claim that the more you orient yourself to this range of problems, the more you potentially incur this contingent risk. And above all, that, you know, we'd have to have a theory of what makes war terrible apart from these, you know, consequences in the form of suffering. And I began the lecture by saying at Nuremberg there was such a theory. Now, sometimes that theory is very literal-minded, and it says what matters is the territory of states, as if that were more important than the people living on it and the harms they suffer. But also part of even the conventional definition of aggression is the political independence of peoples. And I think that's maybe what we've lost in not just in an imperial age, but in a post-imperial age, and we should take more seriously. And I think the prohibition on force is more oriented towards that wrong than any kind of prohibition in the conduct of hostilities. And so that's how I would answer your question, which is a great one.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. I think my question is to do with, you've discussed a lot surrounding illegal wars, and I was just wondering, what are your opinions on, for example, legal wars? I think, well, maybe this is personal, but you know, apart from rape, second and first degree murder, legality can be very subjective. Take, for example, drugs and prostitutions, where in some countries and some states in America, they are legal. And we have, for example, the ongoing wars of the wars on drugs, where aggression seems to not be a problem, and we don't really have any moral ethics concern using aggressions against quote-unquote criminals in that state. So my question is, I think, A, how do you think humanity and your arguments applies to legal wars? And B, whether or not we should then focus less on humanity and on this idea that is an us against them situation, our country, their country, some civilians, criminals, and I suppose the idea of duality rather than humanity. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna interpret your question to answer, but if I get it wrong, just tell me and I'll try again. So, you know, it would be very, I think, interesting to say that the problem in many legal regimes is not that we fail to kind of enforce the laws, but that we do enforce them. The problem is not just the syndrome of illegal infraction, but what the law actually says when it, and you know, what happens when it is enforced. And I think that's an incredibly, I mean, I'm very favorable to that view. I think the history of law is mostly the history of some dominating others. And I think that's definitely true of international law in general, to date. And you can see that if you look at legal wars. So an example would be wars that have been approved by the Security Council, which just means that enough states agreed to allow one of their number to be invaded. And you know, that basically means that that state is unpopular. I mean, that's essentially what happened in the Libyan situation. And again, it can be very troubling when you see that legal wars are really about kind of great power politics, even if you have a lot of concern about the civilian suffering in Libya that justified the war in that case. Then we get to the other main rationale that could make a war legal, which is self-defense. And we didn't really get into that in this discussion, but that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Putin has an argument that he's engaged in a defensive war. And of course, American and British wars of the past 20 years have been defensive wars in most cases. And if we think that this is the problem, which many pacifists have thought, that the problem is not when the law is broken, but it's what the law allows, then we kind of go in a different direction. The reason I'm kind of looking modestly as a first step at just how there has arisen this tradition of more or less incontrovertibly illegal wars that not a lot of people care about. That's a problem to solve too, and it's not the only one. But it's one that's been pretty flagrant and I think has gotten lost until the other day. And I wanted to inquire why. So it's just a very selective, small project. But your project is big and exciting, if I understood it correctly.
I think we've got 3 more questions, one here, and one over there. So can we take those 3 and then stop? Because I know James has said he needs a little bit less than 10 minutes for the next section. So can we take those? We've got time for those 3 questions.
Thank you so much. So I think this argument for a turn to the prevention of aggression and away from humane war is very powerful, and we can see in the room and in the responses to that how powerful it is. But I wonder what sensibility you would urge us to keep in mind when we're doing that. I think because, on the one hand, the prevention of aggression as the prevention of human suffering is an incredibly powerful justification and push in this direction, and we've seen that, to terrible effect in the last few days. On the other hand, wars of aggression and wars for the acquisition of territory have a very powerful political, economic sensibility associated with their prevention. And I think in the contemporary moment, and with multiple developments since 1945 and even since 1974, financialization, the organisation of transnational value chains, the control over technology and disparities in technological power, it's not at all clear, I think, that territory has the same valence that it used to. So what does it mean, I guess, to turn back to aggression in this contemporary moment?
That's a very lovely question. I just want to make one, just to be clear, I'm not saying turn away from humanization. I'm saying supplement it and make sure you're not incurring the risk of humanization. But look, we could argue that Putin is returning to the 19th century. He's doing something very, let's say, boringly familiar in that century or before, which is about territorial expansion. Now, between us, I don't think that's his goal. It seems like he wants regime change and a friendly government of the kind he used to enjoy next door, but we don't know. For now, it looks like it's about territory. And as you say, there are many other forms of domination that prominently include global economic relations. And this is very important because one thing that has dispensed some great powers from engaging in the boring 19th century pursuit of land is that they've understood that other forms of power exist, greater forms of power, that give you control without needing to be present. And yet, Putin's not the only one, because we've seen a lot of states cross border with military hardware, which is boringly familiar, but it's a big problem. And so I think we should solve all of those. But I don't think we can say, because it's ultimately economics that establishes the nature of global human relations, that we should just trivialize war, which is a living reality too.
I think we better have stopped, and if I can ask you to take those questions, remaining questions, to the reception afterwards. I do want to leave a little bit of time for James to actually announce the winners of the Estella Newsom Memorial Prize.
Thanks, Mary. Ooh. Yeah, so the Estella Newsom Memorial Prize is an annual prize for a philosophical essay on issues in ethics arising from conflict and war. And we have this prize through a generous gift from the Christian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, in particular from the estate of their member, Estella Newsom. And so each year there's a prize competition for which essays are judged on purely philosophical grounds. No particular viewpoint has to be defended, and it's open to all undergraduate students at King's. And the 2021 competition was on the topic of conflict and fake news. And the winning entry was an essay by Yulia Tokarczyk, who's now in her final year studying for a BA in liberal arts with modern languages. Yulia's essay was a defense of the view that problems posed by fake news on social media should be addressed by fostering suitable skills in individuals rather than by censorship and the like. And she made a really interesting, independent, well-researched argument for that view. So I'd like to invite her up now to, for some applause.
going with this. But let's continue this discussion over. We have wine. Yes. We have wine. Good news. So this will all continue next door, I think. Please do join us, stay with us, continue this conversation, bring your questions. But let's have a final round of applause for Samuel.